Hi everyone, quick tutorial here on how to create drop shadows on objects, cast shadows and also shadows that can be underneath an object, how to make them quickly and how to make them look realistic. Here I have a coin and I'm going to create a shadow that gets cast off the back. So with my coin layer selected, I'm going to click on the layer effects at the bottom of my layers panel and choose drop shadow. When I call up my layer style panel, I can choose the color of my drop shadow. And if you want something other than black, you want to go ahead and you want to choose your background color. Click this rectangle. It's going to call up your color picker. Your eyedropper tool will be automatically selected. Click on the color that you'd like to sample, and then you can go with that colored sample and you can make that darker in order to create the right color shadow that's going to fit your object. Shadows are always the color of the background, just made substantially darker. So with that color chosen, I can choose the angle of it here, and this is going to adjust the angle of the light. The angle of the light's coming from here on this object, so I adjust that over here. Again, not a big deal because we're going to be breaking this apart and we're going to edit this shadow separately. The distance simply controls how far away it is from the object, and you get a little preview window here of what's going on. Spread will basically make it kind of a hard edge or a softer edge, and then size will really feather this way out. We're going to keep the feather way down, or the size. We're going to click OK. Now to edit this as an actual drop shadow layer, I'm going to go to the word drop shadow in my layer, right or control click, create layer. And this is going to turn this drop shadow effect into a layer. With my command or control T, I'm going to transform this drop shadow. I'm going to right click inside my transform bounding box and choose distort. I'm going to take my drop shadow and I'm simply going to lay it down to create a shadow coming off that coin. Move it into position and hit return. Now I want to go to the filter menu, blur gallery, and choose field blur. I want to blur this coming off the object. So with the field blur, I will be able to go ahead and land points where I would like to have a lot of blur or a little blur. So here I would like to have a little bit of blur. So I land that point and I'm going to then run that around to a very low blur. I'm going to go ahead and land another point over here, which is going to add a lot of blur, and I can add more here. And I want to keep this off the end because if you get it too close to the end here, you can see it kind of creates this kind of area inside here. If you get it too close, it's going to kind of look like a forked end. So you can keep this away. The more blur you have, the further away you can keep it to kind of have that influence on there. That's a bit much. So we go. That looks pretty good. I'm going to click OK in my control bar. Really simple shadow. Now I'm going to set my opacity of my shadow to, say, 80–85% right here. And with that set, it's all good, and I'm happy. But now I want to create just a nicer looking shadow because it looks a little bit soft right here. So with this, I'm going to go back to my original shadow layer, do a command or control J, duplicates that layer. I'm going to do my command or control T, and then I'm going to scale that down and maybe even rotate that a little bit more. And then I want to get this into position so that both my shadows here are going to be nicely tucked up underneath the very edge here. I'm just using my up-down arrows to kind of move everything into place. And what's going to make this look realistic is keeping this slightly dark edge under there, which kind of anchors that shadow to this. Now I can control the opacity of these separately as well, and I can also control the size of these as well, and I could blur these, technically if I wanted to do more blur on this particular one, because it is slightly sharp edge that I can see. I can go into my blur gallery, and I can just put this anywhere. When I have a single point, it's going to blur everything. It's not going to do it kind of like with a halo. And I can get my shadow to be blurred, way too much there, and kind of blur that, and click OK. So it's just a really quick way to put that in there and make that look good. Making sure that when you do your shadows here, you want to make sure that you get that just that slight dark edge at the bottom here. Not too much, not too little, but that creates kind of that little edge right there that shows that it's anchored. If you want this to be coming off, then you're going to move your drop shadow way down here. But if it's way up here, it doesn't look realistic. You really need just that ever so slight hint of that edge under there to make that work. We're going to create another drop shadow here, but now we're going to do a puddle shadow underneath. I'm going to keep my settings the same and click OK. Right-click on drop shadow, create a layer from that, select that layer, Command or Control T. I'm going to squish this all down. I'm going to rotate this so that it's on the same plane as my coin. And transform this again, probably a little bit smaller. And there it is. I'm going to park that so that it is sitting right there with that nice little edge right there. Now going into the filter menu, blur gallery, field blur. My last setting of my blur is going to always come up, so I'm going to move this off to the end to create a blur, because as it gets further away, it gets more blurry. And I'm going to land a point in here that has no blur at all on it, which is then going to kind of sharpen that. I'm going to move these in to kind of create more of an influence on this as well. Probably going to blur this just a bit more, because I think that needs just a bit more blur in there to make it look good. Now I'm going to click OK. I can set the opacity of this down to make this look quite realistic. And then I'm going to go back to this layer again, Command or Control J to duplicate this, Command or Control T, and I'm going to scale down my entire drop shadow again here. I'm going to zoom in so you can see. I'm going to put that little shadow right there. I think I need to rotate this just a little bit. Kind of pull that up to make that work. And now I'm going to zoom back out, and you can see right there how it creates that nice shadow. Now what happens if you have something along the lines of this, like this noodle, where you create a kind of a shadow under here, but you're going to have a lot of light coming in underneath. Same concept. We're going to go in and create a drop shadow, and we're going to click OK. Right-click on the shadow, create that into a layer. I'm going to use Command or Control T for transform, and I'm going to scale this. Make sure that you're always on the right layer. I'm just scaling the noodle. I'm going to use my Command T or Control T for transform. Again, scale this down, position this into the area where it belongs at my noodle, making it kind of look like it's about the same width right there. And then go back into the filter menu, go back under my blur gallery, field blur, and of course I can blur the whole thing. I'm going to move this off to the end so I can kind of blur the ends. I'm going to park one over there as well, keeps the same blur setting. Park one in the middle here, which has far less blur because it's going to be a little bit sharper. Now I'm going to click OK. I'm going to set the opacity back down on this so that we have a lower opacity, say 80–85%. Now, of course, if I put my drop shadow up here, I'm actually going to cut the opacity down more. If I put my drop shadow down here, it makes it look like the entire thing is floating. Okay? Well, when I do this, you can see the blur comes out the sides. I'm actually going to make this a little bit smaller here because this would probably be more realistic if this were floating. I don't want it to be floating, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to move this right up here so it's nice and tight. Again, I'm going to duplicate this layer using Command or Control J, get my duplicate layer, and I'm going to transform this whole thing, and I'm going to make it smaller, bringing my drop shadow in and creating a tighter and darker drop shadow right here, but creating that nice little edge right there. And I'm going to do a little bit more transform to bring that in to make that look good. Do that right there. And then I can always blur this a little bit more if I need to. But this is a really quick way to go in and make it look like the shadow is very realistic. If I want to do just a general blur on this overall, where I don't have to go ahead and locate the points, I can always go under the filter menu, blur, and then do a Gaussian blur. And a Gaussian blur allows me to just do a general blur overall without having to go in and actually pinpoint the areas in which I'd like to blur. So here, that nice little anchor shadow right there is going to be the key to making it look like it's actually sitting on the surface. If the shadows are up too far, it doesn't look realistic. If they're down too far or too light, it always makes it look like it's floating. And I'm going to move this right here. You'll also notice that all our shadows are always set to multiply. Why? Well, whenever you go ahead and you do a shadow, you always want it to go ahead and kind of blend in with your surface. And if you don't use multiply as a blending mode, it will look kind of gray, and it'll kind of sit there and it doesn't look realistic. Multiply allows it to go through and actually blend with the surface. So whenever you do drop shadows, always set it to multiply. But remember, it's super simple. If you mess up, all you have to do is go back in, create a new drop shadow layer here, and start all over again. It's that simple.